Evangelii Gaudium, Apostolic Exhortation of the Holy Father Francis, on the proclamation of the Gospel in today's world. Chapter 2. Amid the Crisis of Communal Commitment. Before taking up some basic questions related to the work of evangelization, it may be helpful to mention briefly the context in which we all have to live and work. Today, we frequently hear of a diagnostic overload, which is not always accompanied by improved and actually applicable methods of treatment. Nor would we be well served by a purely sociological analysis which would aim to embrace all of reality by employing an allegedly neutral and clinical method. What I would like to propose is something much more in the line of an evangelical discernment. It is the approach of a missionary disciple, an approach nourished by the light and strength of the Holy Spirit. It is not the task of the Pope to offer a detailed and complete analysis of contemporary reality, but I do exhort all the communities to an ever-watchful scrutiny of the signs of the times. This is in fact a grave responsibility, since certain present realities, unless effectively dealt with, are capable of setting off processes of dehumanization, which would then be hard to reverse. We need to distinguish clearly what might be a fruit of the kingdom from what runs counter to God's plan. This involves not only recognizing and discerning spirits, but also, and this is decisive, choosing movements of the spirit of good and rejecting those of the spirit of evil. I take for granted the different analyses which other documents of the Universal Magisterium have offered, as well as those proposed by the regional and national conferences of bishops. In this exhortation, I claim only to consider briefly, and from a pastoral perspective, certain factors which can restrain or weaken the impulse of missionary renewal in the Church, either because they threaten the life and dignity of God's people, or because they affect those who are directly involved in the Church's institutions and her work of evangelization. Some challenges of today's world. In our time, humanity is experiencing a turning point in its history, as we can see from the advances being made in so many fields. We can only praise the steps being taken to improve people's welfare in areas such as healthcare, education, and communications. At the same time, we have to remember the majority of our contemporaries are barely living from day to day, with dire consequences. A number of diseases are spreading. The hearts of many people are gripped by fear and desperation, even in the so-called rich countries. The joy of living frequently fades. Lack of respect for others and violence are on the rise, and inequality is increasingly evident. It is a struggle to live, and often to live with precious little dignity. This epochal change has been set in motion by the enormous qualitative, quantitative, rapid and cumulative advances occurring in the sciences and in technology, and by their instant application in different areas of nature and of life. We are in an age of knowledge and information, which has led to new and often anonymous kinds of power. No to an economy of exclusion. Just as the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say, "Thou shalt not," to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. How can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? This is a case of exclusion. Can we continue to stand by when food is thrown away while people are starving? This is a case of inequality. Today, everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. Human beings are themselves considered consumer goods to be used and then discarded. We have created a throwaway culture, which is now spreading. It is no longer simply about exploitation and oppression, but something new. Exclusion ultimately has to do with what it means to be part of the society in which we live. Those excluded are no longer society's underside or its fringes or its disenfranchised. They are no longer even a part of it. The excluded are not the exploited, but the outcast, the leftovers. In this context, some people continue to defend trickle-down theories, which assume that economic growth, encouraged by a free market, will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those yielding economic power, and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. To sustain a lifestyle which excludes others, or to sustain enthusiasm for that selfish ideal, a globalization of indifference has developed. Almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain, and feeling a need to help them, as though all this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. The culture of prosperity deadens us. We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase. In the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us. No to the new idolatry of money. One cause of this situation is found in our relationship with money, since we calmly accept its dominion over ourselves and our societies. The current financial crisis can make us overlook the fact that it originated in a profound human crisis, the denial of the primacy of the human person. We have created new idols. The worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose. The worldwide crisis affecting finance and the economy lays bare their imbalances, and above all, their lack of real concern for human beings. Man is reduced to one of his needs alone: consumption. While the earnings of the minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. This imbalance is the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the right of states, charged with vigilance of the common good, to exercise any form of control. A new tyranny is thus born, invisible and often virtual, which unilaterally and relentlessly imposes its own laws and rules. Debt and the accumulation of interest also make it difficult for countries to realize the potential of their own economies and keep citizens from enjoying their real purchasing power. To all this, we can add widespread corruption and self-serving tax evasion, which have taken on worldwide dimensions. The thirst for power and possessions knows no limits. In this system, which tends to devour everything which stands in the way of increased profits, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which become the only rule. No to a financial system which rules rather than serves. Behind this attitude lurks a rejection of ethics and a rejection of God. Ethics has come to be viewed with a certain scornful derision. It is seen as counterproductive, too human, because it makes money and power relative. It is felt to be a threat since it condemns the manipulation and debasement of the person. In effect, ethics leads to a God who calls for a committed response which is outside the categories of the marketplace. When these latter are absolutized, God can only be seen as uncontrollable, unmanageable, even dangerous, since he calls human beings to their full realization and to freedom from all forms of enslavement. Ethics, a non-ideological ethics, would make it possible to bring about balance and a more humane social order. With this in mind, I encourage financial experts and political leaders to ponder the words of one of the sages of antiquity. Not to share one's wealth with the poor is to steal from them and to take away their livelihood. It is not our own goods which we hold, but theirs. A financial reform open to such ethical considerations would require a vigorous change of approach on the part of political leaders. I urge them to face this challenge with determination and an eye to the future, while not ignoring, of course, the specifics of each case. Money must serve, not rule. The Pope loves everyone, rich and poor alike, but he is obliged, in the name of Christ, to remind all that the rich must help, respect, and promote the poor. I exhort you to a generous solidarity and to the return of economics and finance to an ethical approach which favors human beings. No to the inequality which spawns violence. Today, in many places, we hear a call for greater security. But until exclusion and inequality in society and between peoples are reversed, it will be impossible to eliminate violence. The poor and the poorer peoples are accused of violence. Yet without equal opportunities, the different forms of aggression and conflict will find a fertile terrain for growth and eventually explode. When a society, whether local, national, or global, is willing to leave a part of itself on the fringes, no political programs or resources spent on law enforcement or surveillance systems can indefinitely guarantee tranquility. This is not the case simply because inequality provokes a violent reaction from those excluded from the system, but because the socioeconomic system is unjust at its root. Just as goodness tends to spread, the toleration of evil, which is injustice, tends to expand its baneful influence and quietly to undermine any political and social system, no matter how solid it may appear. If every action has its consequences, and evil embedded in the structures of society has a constant potential for disintegration and death, it is evil crystallized in unjust social structures which cannot be the basis of hope for a better future. We are far from the so-called end of history, since the conditions for a sustainable and peaceful development have not yet been adequately articulated and realized. Today's economic mechanisms promote inordinate consumption, yet it is evident that unbridled consumerism combined with inequality proves doubly damaging to the social fabric. Inequality eventually engenders a violence which recourse to arms never will be able to resolve. It serves only to offer false hopes to those clamoring for heightened security, even though nowadays we know that weapons and violence, rather than providing solutions, create new and more serious conflicts. Some simply content themselves with blaming the poor and the poorer countries themselves for their troubles. Indulging in unwarranted generalizations, they claim that the solution is an education that would tranquilize them, making them tame and harmless. All this becomes even more exasperating for the marginalized in the light of the widespread and deeply rooted corruption found in many countries, in their governments, businesses, and institutions, whatever the political ideology of their leaders. Some cultural challenges. We also evangelize when we attempt to confront the various challenges which can arise. On occasion, these may take the form of veritable attacks on religious freedom or new persecutions directed against Christians. In some countries, these have reached alarming levels of hatred and violence. In many places, the problem is more that of widespread indifference and relativism, linked to disillusionment and the crisis of ideologies which has come about as a reaction to anything which might appear totalitarian. This not only harms the Church, but the fabric of society as a whole. We should recognize how in a culture where each person wants to be the bearer of his or her own subjective truth, it becomes difficult for citizens to devise a common plan which transcends individual gain and personal ambitions. In the prevailing culture, priority is given to the outward, the immediate, the visible, the quick, the superficial, and the provisional. What is real gives way to appearances. In many countries, globalization has meant a hastened deterioration of their own cultural roots and the invasion of ways of thinking and acting proper to other cultures which are economically advanced but ethically debilitated. This fact has been brought up by bishops from various continents in different synods. The African bishops, for example, taking up the encyclical So Saludo Rei Socialis, pointed out years ago that there have been frequent attempts to make the African countries parts of a machine, cogs in a gigantic wheel. This is often true also in the field of social communications, which, being run by centers mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, do not always give due consideration to the priorities and problems of such countries or respect their cultural makeup. By the same token, the bishops of Asia underlined the external influences being brought to bear on Asian cultures. New patterns of behavior are emerging as a result of overexposure to the mass media. As a result, the negative aspects of the media and entertainment industries are threatening traditional values, and in particular, the sacredness of marriage and the stability of the family. The Catholic faith of many peoples nowadays is being challenged by the proliferation of new religious movements, some of which tend to fundamentalism, while others seem to propose a spirituality without God. This is, on the one hand, a human reaction to a materialistic, consumeristic, and individualistic society. But it is also a means of exploiting the weaknesses of people living in poverty and on the fringes of society, people who make ends meet amid great human suffering and are looking for immediate solutions to their needs. These religious movements, not without a certain shrewdness, come to fill, within a predominantly individualistic culture, a vacuum left by secularist rationalism. We must recognize that if part of our baptized people lack a sense of belonging to the Church, this is also due to certain structures and the occasional unwelcoming atmosphere of some of our parishes and communities, or to a bureaucratic way of dealing with problems, be they simple or complex, in the lives of our people. In many places, an administrative approach prevails over a pastoral approach, as does a concentration on administering the sacraments apart from other forms of evangelization. The process of secularization tends to reduce the faith and the Church to the sphere of the private and the personal. Furthermore, by completely rejecting the transcendent, it has produced a growing deterioration of ethics, a weakening of the sense of personal and collective sin, and a steady increase in relativism. These have led to a general sense of disorientation, especially in the periods of adolescence and young adulthood, which are so vulnerable to change. As the bishops of the United States of America have rightly pointed out, while the Church insists on the existence of objective moral norms which are valid for everyone, there are those in our culture who portray this teaching as unjust, that is, as opposed to basic human rights. Such claims usually follow a form of moral relativism that is joined, not without inconsistency, to a belief in the absolute rights of individuals. In this view, the Church is perceived as promoting a particular prejudice and as interfering with individual freedom. We are living in an information-driven society which bombards us indiscriminately with data, all treated as being of equal importance, and which leads to remarkable superficiality in the area of moral discernment. In response, we need to provide an education which teaches critical thinking and encourages the development of mature moral values. Despite the tide of secularism which has swept our societies, in many countries, even those where Christians are a minority, the Catholic Church is considered a credible institution by public opinion, and trusted for her solidarity and concern for those in greatest need. Again and again, the Church has acted as a mediator in finding solutions to problems affecting peace, social harmony, the land, the defense of life, human and civil rights, and so forth. And how much good has been done by Catholic schools and universities around the world. This is a good thing, yet we find it difficult to make people see that when we raise other questions less palpable to public opinion, we are doing so out of fidelity to precisely the same convictions about human dignity and the common good. The family is experiencing a profound cultural crisis, as are all communities and social bonds. In the case of the family, the weakening of these bonds is particularly serious because the family is the fundamental cell of society where we learn to live with others despite our differences and to belong to one another. It is also the place where parents pass on the faith to their children. Marriage now tends to be viewed as a form of mere emotional satisfaction that can be constructed in any way or modified at will. But the indispensable contribution of marriage to society transcends the feelings and momentary needs of the couple. As the French bishops have taught, it is not born of loving sentiment, ephemeral by definition, but from the depth of the obligation assumed by the spouses who accept to enter a total communion of life. The individualism of our postmodern and globalized era favors a lifestyle which weakens the development and stability of personal relationships and distorts family bonds. pastoral activity needs to bring out more clearly the fact that our relationship with the Father demands and encourages a communion which heals, promotes, and reinforces personal bonds. In our world, especially in some countries, different forms of war and conflict are re-emerging. Yet we Christians remain steadfast in our intention to respect others, to heal wounds, to build bridges, to strengthen relationships, and to bear one another's burdens. Today, too, various associations for the defense of rights and the pursuit of noble goals are being founded. This is a sign of the desire of many people to contribute to social and cultural progress. Challenges to inculturating the faith. The Christian substratum of certain peoples, most of all in the West, is a living reality. Here we find, especially among the most needy, a moral resource which preserves the values of an authentic Christian humanism. Seeing reality with the eyes of faith, we cannot fail to acknowledge what the Holy Spirit is sowing. It would show a lack of trust in His free and unstinting activity to think that authentic Christian values are absent where great numbers of people have received baptism and expressed their faith and solidarity with others in a variety of ways. This means more than acknowledging occasional seeds of the Word, since it has to do with an authentic Christian faith which has its own expressions and means of showing its relationship to the Church. The immense importance of a culture marked by faith cannot be overlooked. Before the onslaught of contemporary secularism, an evangelized culture, for all its limits, has many more resources than the mere sum total of believers. An evangelized popular culture contains values of faith and solidarity capable of encouraging and developing a more just and believing society, and possesses a particular wisdom which ought to be gratefully acknowledged. It is imperative to evangelize cultures in order to enculturate the gospel. In countries of Catholic tradition, this means encouraging, fostering, and reinforcing a richness which already exists. In countries of other religious traditions, or profoundly secularized countries, it will mean sparking a new process for evangelizing culture, even though these will demand long-term planning. We must keep in mind, however, that we are constantly being called to grow. Each culture and social group needs purification and growth. In the case of the popular cultures of Catholic peoples, we can see deficiencies which need to be healed by the gospel. Machismo, alcoholism, domestic violence, low mass attendance, fatalistic or superstitious notions which lead to sorcery, and the like. Popular piety itself can be the starting point for healing and liberation from these deficiencies. It is also true that at times greater emphasis is placed on the outward expressions of traditions of some groups, or on an alleged private revelation which would replace all else, than on the impulse of Christian piety. There is a kind of Christianity made up of devotions reflecting an individual and sentimental faith, which does not, in fact, correspond to authentic popular piety. Some people promote these expressions while not being in the least concerned with the advancement of society or the formation of the laity, and in certain cases, they do so in order to obtain economic benefits or some power over others. Nor can we overlook the fact that in recent decades, there has been a breakdown in the way Catholics pass down the Christian faith to the young. It is undeniable that many people feel disillusioned and no longer identify with the Catholic tradition. Growing numbers of parents do not bring their children for baptism or teach them how to pray. There is also a certain exodus towards other faith communities. The causes of this breakdown include a lack of opportunity for dialogue in families, the influence of communications media, a relativistic subjectivism, unbridled consumerism which feeds the market, lack of personal care among the poor, the failure of our institutions to be welcoming, and our difficulty in restoring a mystical adherence to the faith in a pluralistic religious landscape. Challenges from urban cultures. The New Jerusalem, a holy city, is the goal towards which all of humanity is moving. It is curious that God's revelation tells us that the fullness of humanity and of history is realized in a city. We need to look at our cities with a contemplative gaze, a gaze of faith, which sees God dwelling in their homes, in their streets and squares. God's presence accompanies the sincere efforts of individuals and groups to find encouragement and meaning in their lives. He dwells among them, fostering solidarity, fraternity, and the desire for goodness, truth, and justice. This presence must not be contrived, but found, uncovered. God does not hide himself from those who seek him with a sincere heart, even though they do so tentatively, in a vague and haphazard manner. In cities, as opposed to the countryside, the religious dimension of life is expressed by different styles, daily rhythms linked to places and people. In their daily lives, people must often struggle for survival, and this struggle contains within it a profound understanding of life, which often includes a deep religious sense. We must examine these more closely in order to enter into a dialogue like that of our Lord and the Samaritan woman at the well, where she sought to quench her thirst. New cultures are constantly being born in these vast new expanses where Christians are no longer the customary interpreters or generators of meaning. Instead, they themselves take from these cultures new languages, symbols, messages, and paradigms which propose new approaches to life, approaches often in contrast with the gospel of Jesus. A completely new culture has come to life and continues to grow in the cities. The Synod noted that today the changes taking place in these great spaces and the culture which they create are a privileged locus of the new evangelization. This challenges us to imagine innovative spaces and possibilities for prayer and communion, which are more attractive and meaningful for city dwellers. Through the influence of the media, rural areas are being affected by the same cultural changes, which are significantly altering their way of life as well. What is called for is an evangelization capable of shedding light on these new ways of relating to God, to others, and to the world around us, and inspiring essential values. It must reach the places where new narratives and paradigms are being formed, bringing the word of Jesus to the inmost soul of our cities. Cities are multicultural. In the larger cities, a connective network is found in which groups of people share a common imagination and dreams about life, and new human interactions arise, new cultures, invisible cities. Various subcultures exist side by side and often practice segregation and violence. The Church is called to be at the service of a difficult dialogue. On the one hand, there are people who have the means needed to develop their personal and family lives, but there are also many non-citizens, half-citizens, and urban remnants. Cities create a sort of permanent ambivalence because, while they offer their residents countless possibilities, they also present many people with any number of obstacles to the full development of their lives. This contrast causes painful suffering. In many parts of the world, cities are the scene of mass protests where thousands of people call for freedom, a voice in public life, justice, and a variety of other demands which, if not properly understood, will not be silenced by force. We cannot ignore the fact that in cities, human trafficking, the narcotics trade, the abuse and exploitation of minors, the abandonment of the elderly and infirm, and various forms of corruption and criminal activity take place. At the same time, what could be significant places of encounter and solidarity often become places of isolation and mutual distrust. Houses and neighborhoods are more often built to isolate and protect than to connect and integrate. The proclamation of the gospel will be a basis for restoring the dignity of human life in these contexts, for Jesus desires to pour out an abundance of life upon our cities. The unified and complete sense of human life that the gospel proposes is the best remedy for the ills of our cities, even though we have to realize that a uniform and rigid program of evangelization is not suited to this complex reality. But to live our human life in the fullest and to meet every challenge as a leaven of gospel witness in every culture and in every city will make us better Christians and bear fruit in our cities. Temptations faced by pastoral workers. I feel tremendous gratitude to all those who are committed to working in and for the Church. Here, I do not wish to discuss at length the activities of different pastoral workers, from bishops down to those who provide the most humble and hidden services. Rather, I would like to reflect on the challenges that all of them must face in the context of our current globalized culture. But in justice, I must say first that the contribution of the Church in today's world is enormous. The pain and the shame that we feel at the sins of some members of the Church and at our own must never make us forget how many Christians are giving their lives in love. They help so many people to be healed or to die in peace in makeshift hospitals. They are present to those enslaved by different addictions in the poorest places on earth. They devote themselves to the education of children and young people. They take care of the elderly who have been forgotten by everyone else. They look for ways to communicate values in hostile environments. They are dedicated in many other ways to showing an immense love for humanity inspired by the God who became man. I am grateful for the beautiful example given to me by so many Christians who joyfully sacrifice their lives and their time. This witness comforts and sustains me in my own effort to overcome selfishness and to give more fully of myself. As children of this age, though, all of us are in some way affected by the present globalized culture, which, while offering us values and new possibilities, can also limit, condition, and ultimately harm us. I am aware that we need to create spaces where pastoral workers can be helped and healed, places where faith itself in the crucified and risen Jesus is renewed, where the most profound questions and daily concerns are shared, where deeper discernment about our experiences and life itself is undertaken in the light of the gospel, for the purpose of directing individual and social decisions towards the good and the beautiful. At the same time, I would like to call attention to certain particular temptations which affect pastoral workers. Yes to the challenge of a missionary spirituality. Today we are seeing in many pastoral workers, including consecrated men and women, an inordinate concern for their personal freedom and relaxation, which leads them to see their work as a mere appendage to their life, as if it were not part of their very identity. At the same time, the spiritual life comes to be identified with a few religious exercises, which can offer a certain comfort, but which do not encourage encounter with others, engagement with the world, or a passion for evangelization. As a result, one can observe in many agents of evangelization, even though they pray, a heightened individualism, a crisis of identity, and a cooling of fervor. These are three evils which fuel one another. At times, our media culture and some intellectual circles convey a marked skepticism with regard to the Church's message, along with a certain cynicism. As a consequence, many pastoral workers, although they pray, develop a sort of inferiority complex which leads them to relativize or conceal their Christian identity and convictions. This produces a vicious circle. They end up being unhappy with who they are and what they do. They do not identify with their mission of evangelization, and this weakens their commitment. They end up stifling the joy of mission with a kind of obsession about being like everyone else and possessing what everyone else possesses. Their work of evangelization thus becomes forced, and they devote little energy and very limited time to it. Pastoral workers can thus fall into a relativism which, whatever their particular style of spirituality or way of thinking, proves even more dangerous than doctrinal relativism. It has to do with the deepest and inmost decisions that shape their way of life. This practical relativism consists in acting as if God did not exist, making decisions as if the poor did not exist, setting goals as if others did not exist, working as if people who have not received the gospel did not exist. It is striking that even some who clearly have solid doctrinal and spiritual convictions frequently fall into a lifestyle which leads to an attachment to financial security or to a desire for power or human glory at all costs, rather than giving their lives to others in mission. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of missionary enthusiasm. No to selfishness and spiritual sloth. At a time when we most need a missionary dynamism which will bring salt and light to the world, many lay people fear that they may be asked to undertake some apostolic work, and they may seek to avoid any responsibility that may take away from their free time. For example, it has become very difficult today to find trained parish catechists willing to persevere in this work for some years. Something similar is also happening with priests who are obsessed with protecting their free time. This is frequently due to the fact that people feel an overbearing need to guard their personal freedom, as though the task of evangelization was a dangerous poison rather than a joyful response to God's love, which summons us to mission and makes us fulfilled and productive. Some resist giving themselves over completely to mission and thus end up in a state of paralysis and acedia. The problem is not always an excess of activity, but rather activity undertaken badly, without adequate motivation, without a spirituality which would permeate it and make it pleasurable. As a result, work becomes more tiring than necessary, even leading at times to illness. Far from a content and happy tiredness, this is a tense, burdensome, dissatisfying, and in the end, unbearable fatigue. This pastoral acedia can be caused by a number of things. Some fall into it because they throw themselves into unrealistic projects and are not satisfied simply to do what they reasonably can. Others, because they lack the patience to allow processes to mature, they want everything to fall from heaven. Others, because they are attached to a few projects or vain dreams of success. Others, because they have lost real contact with people and so depersonalize their work that they are more concerned with the roadmap than with the journey itself. Others fall into acedia because they are unable to wait. They want to dominate the rhythm of life. Today's obsession with immediate results makes it hard for pastoral workers to tolerate anything that smacks of disagreement, possible failure, criticism, the cross. And so, the biggest threat of all gradually takes shape, the gray pragmatism of the daily life of the church, in which all appears to proceed normally, while in reality, faith is wearing down and degenerating into small-mindedness. A tomb psychology thus develops and slowly transforms Christians into mummies in a museum. Disillusioned with reality, with the church, and with themselves, they experience a constant temptation to cling to a faint melancholy, lacking in hope, which seizes the heart like the most precious of the devil's potions. Called to radiate light and communicate life, in the end, they are caught up in things that generate only darkness and inner weariness, and slowly consume all zeal for the apostolate. For all this I repeat, let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of the joy of evangelization. No to a sterile pessimism. The joy of the gospel is such that it cannot be taken away from us by anyone or anything. The evils of our world and those of the church must not be excuses for diminishing our commitment and our fervor. Let us look upon them as challenges which can help us to grow. With the eyes of faith, we can see the light which the Holy Spirit always radiates in the mists of darkness, never forgetting that, where sin increased, grace has abounded all the more. Our faith is challenged to discern how wine can come from water and how wheat can grow in the midst of weeds. 50 years after the Second Vatican Council, we are distressed by the troubles of our age and far from naive optimism. Yet the fact that we are more realistic must not mean that we are any less trusting in the Spirit or less generous. In this sense, we can once again listen to the words of Blessed John the 23rd on the memorable day of the 11th of October, 1962. He says, "At times we have to listen, much to our regret, to the voices of people who, though burning with zeal, lack a sense of discretion and measure. In this modern age, they can see nothing but prevarication and ruin. We feel that we must disagree with those prophets of doom who are always forecasting disaster, as though the end of the world were at hand. In our times, divine providence is leading us to a new order of human relations, which, by human effort and even beyond all expectations, are directed to the fulfillment of God's superior and inscrutable designs, in which everything, even human setbacks, leads to the greater good of the Church." One of the more serious temptations which stifles boldness and zeal is a defeatism which turns us into querulous and disillusioned pessimists, sourpusses. Nobody can go off to battle unless he is fully convinced of victory beforehand. If we start without confidence, we have already lost half the battle, and we bury our talents. While painfully aware of our own frailties, we have to march on without giving in, keeping in mind that the Lord said to St. Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness." Christian triumph is always a cross, yet a cross which is at the same time a victorious banner borne with aggressive tenderness against the assaults of evil. The evil spirit of defeatism is brother to the temptation to separate, before its time, the wheat from the weeds. It is the fruit of an anxious and self-centered lack of trust. In some places, a spiritual desertification has already come about, as the result of attempts by some societies to build without God, or to eliminate their Christian roots. In those places, the Christian world is becoming sterile, and it is depleting itself like an overexploited ground which transforms into a desert. In other countries, violent opposition to Christianity forces Christians to hide their faith in their own beloved homeland. This is another painful kind of desert, but family and the workplace can also be a parched place where faith nonetheless has to be preserved and communicated. Yet, it is starting from the experience of this desert, from this void, that we can again discover the joy of believing, its vital importance for us men and women. In the desert, we rediscover the value of what is essential for living. Thus, in today's world, there are innumerable signs, often expressed implicitly or negatively, for the thirst of God, for the ultimate meaning of life. And in the desert, people of faith are needed who, by the example of their own lives, point out the way to the promised land and keep hope alive. In these situations, we are called to be living sources of water from which others can drink. At times, this becomes a heavy cross, but it was from the cross, from his pierced side, that our Lord gave himself to us as a source of living water. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of hope. Yes to the new relationships brought by Christ. Today, when the networks and means of human communication have made unprecedented advances, we sense the challenge of finding and sharing a mystique of living together, of mingling and encounter, of embracing and supporting one another, of stepping into this flood tide, which, while chaotic, can become a genuine experience of fraternity, a caravan of solidarity, a sacred pilgrimage. Greater possibilities for communication thus turn into greater possibilities for encounter and solidarity for everyone. If we were able to take this route, it would be so good, so soothing, so liberating and hope-filled. To go out of ourselves and to join others is healthy for us. To be self-enclosed is to taste the bitter poison of immanence, and humanity will be worse for every selfish choice we make. The Christian ideal will always be a summons to overcome suspicion, habitual mistrust, fear of losing our privacy, all the defensive attitudes which today's world imposes on us. Many try to escape from others and take refuge in the comfort of their privacy or in a small circle of close friends, renouncing the realism of the social aspect of the gospel. For just as some people want a purely spiritual Christ, without flesh and without the cross, they also want their interpersonal relationships provided for by sophisticated equipment, by screens and systems which can be turned on and off on command. Meanwhile, the gospel tells us constantly to run the risk of a face-to-face encounter with others, with their physical presence which challenges us, with their pain and their pleas, with their joy which infects us in our close and continuous interaction. True faith in the incarnate Son of God is inseparable from self-giving, from membership in the community, from service, from reconciliation with others. The Son of God, by becoming flesh, summoned us to the revolution of tenderness. Isolation, which is a version of immanentism, can find expression in a false autonomy which has no place for God. But in the realm of religion, it can also take the form of a spiritual consumerism tailored to one's own unhealthy individualism. The return to the sacred and the quest for spirituality which mark our own time are ambiguous phenomena. Today, our challenge is not so much atheism as the need to respond adequately to many people's thirst for God, lest they try to satisfy it with alienating solutions or with a disembodied Jesus who demands nothing of us with regard to others. Unless these people find in the church a spirituality which can offer healing and liberation and fill them with life and peace, while at the same time summoning them to a fraternal communion and missionary fruitfulness, they will end up by being taken in by solutions which neither make life truly human nor give glory to God. Genuine forms of popular religiosity are incarnate, since they are born of the incarnation of Christian faith in popular culture. For this reason, they entail a personal relationship, not with vague spiritual energies or powers, but with God, with Christ, with Mary, with the saints. These devotions are fleshly. They have a face. They are capable of fostering relationships and not just enabling escapism. In other parts of our society, we see the growing attraction to various forms of spirituality of well-being, divorced from any community life, or to a theology of prosperity, detached from responsibility for our brothers and sisters, or to depersonalized experiences which are nothing more than a form of self-centeredness. One important challenge is to show that the solution will never be found in fleeing from a personal and committed relationship with God, which at the same time commits us to serving others. This happens frequently nowadays, as believers seek to hide or keep apart from others, or quietly flit from one place to another, or from one task to another, without creating deep and stable bonds. Imaginatio locorum et multatio multos fefelit, which translates, dreaming of different places and moving from one to another has misled many. This is a false remedy which cripples the heart and at times the body as well. We need to help others to realize that the only way is to learn how to encounter others with the right attitude, which is to accept and esteem them as companions along the way without interior resistance. Better yet, it means learning to find Jesus in the faces of others, in their voices, in their pleas, and learning to suffer in the embrace of the crucified Jesus whenever we are unjustly attacked or are met with ingratitude, never tiring of our decision to live in fraternity. There indeed we find true healing, since the way to relate to others, which truly heals instead of debilitating us, is a mystical fraternity, a contemplative fraternity. It is a fraternal love capable of seeing the sacred grandeur of our neighbor, of finding God in every human being, of tolerating the nuisances of life in common by clinging to the love of God, of opening the heart to divine love and seeking the happiness of others just as their heavenly Father does. Here and now, especially where we are a little flock, the Lord's disciples are called to live as a community which is the salt of the earth and the light of the world. We are called to bear witness to a constantly new way of living together in fidelity to the gospel. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of community. No to spiritual worldliness. Spiritual worldliness, which hides behind the appearance of piety and even love for the church, consists in seeking not the Lord's glory, but human glory and personal well-being. It is what the Lord reprimanded the Pharisees for when he said, "How can you believe who receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from only God?" It is a subtle way of seeking one's own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. It takes on many forms, depending on the kinds of persons and groups into which it seeps. Since it is based on carefully cultivated appearances, it is not always linked to outward sin. From without, everything appears as it should be, but if it were to seep into the church, it would be infinitely more disastrous than any other worldliness which is simply moral. This worldliness can be fueled in two deeply interrelated ways. One is the attraction of Gnosticism, a purely subjective faith, whose only interest is a certain experience or a set of ideas and bits of information which are meant to console and enlighten, but which ultimately keep one imprisoned in his or her own thoughts and feelings. The other is the self-absorbed Promethean Neo-Pelagianism of those who ultimately trust only in their own powers and feel superior to others because they observe certain rules or remain intransiently faithful to a particular Catholic style from the past. A supposed soundness of doctrine or discipline leads instead to a narcissistic and authoritarian elitism, whereby instead of evangelizing, one analyzes and classifies others, and instead of opening the door to grace, one exhausts his or her energies in inspecting and verifying. In neither case is one really concerned about Jesus Christ or others. These are manifestations of an anthropocentric immanentism. It is impossible to think that a genuine evangelizing thrust could emerge from these adulterated forms of Christianity. This insidious worldliness is evident in a number of attitudes which appear opposed, yet all have the same pretense of taking over the space of the church. In some people, we see an ostentatious preoccupation for the liturgy, for doctrine, and for the church's prestige, but without any concern that the gospel have a real impact on God's faithful people and the concrete needs of the present time. In this way, the life of the church turns into a museum piece or something which is the property of a select few. In others, this spiritual worldliness lurks behind a fascination with social and political gain, or pride in their ability to manage practical affairs, or in obsession with programs of self-help and self-realization. It can also translate into a concern to be seen, into a social life full of appearances, meetings, dinners, and receptions. It can also lead to a business mentality, caught up with the management statistics, plans, and evaluations whose principal beneficiary is not God's people, but the church as an institution. The mark of Christ, incarnate, crucified, and risen is not present. Closed and elite groups are formed, and no effort is made to go forth and seek out those who are distant, or the immense multitudes who thirst for Christ. Evangelical fervor is replaced by the empty pleasure of complacency and self-indulgence. This way of thinking also feeds the vainglory of those who are content to have a modicum of power and would rather be the general of a defeated army than a mere private in a unit which continues to fight. How often we dream up vast apostolic projects, meticulously planned, just like defeated generals. But this is to deny our history as a church, which is glorious precisely because it is a history of sacrifice, of hopes and daily struggles, of lives spent in service and fidelity to work, tiring as it may be, for all work is the sweat of our brow. Instead, we waste time talking about what needs to be done. In Spanish, we call this the sin of abricaísmo, like spiritual masters and pastoral experts who give instructions from on high. We indulge in endless fantasies, and we lose contact with the real lives and difficulties of our people. Those who have fallen into this worldliness look on from above and afar. They reject the prophecy of their brothers and sisters. They discredit those who raise questions. They constantly point out the mistakes of others, and they are obsessed by appearances. Their hearts are open only to the limited horizon of their own immanence and interests, and as a consequence, they neither learn from their sins, nor are they genuinely open to forgiveness. This is a tremendous corruption disguised as a good. We need to avoid it by making the church constantly go out from herself, keeping her mission focused on Jesus Christ and her commitment to the poor. God save us from a worldly church with superficial spiritual and pastoral trappings. This stifling worldliness can only be healed by breathing in the pure air of the Holy Spirit, who frees us from self-centeredness, cloaked in an onward religiosity bereft of God. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of the gospel. No to warring among ourselves. How many wars take place within the people of God and in our different communities? In our neighborhoods and the workplace, how many wars are caused by envy and jealousy, even among Christians? Spiritual worldliness leads some Christians to war with other Christians who stand in the way of their quest for power, prestige, pleasure, and economic security. Some are even no longer content to live as part of the greater church community, but stoke a spirit of exclusivity, creating an inner circle. Instead of belonging to the whole church in all its rich variety, they belong to this or that group which thinks itself different or special. Our world is being torn apart by wars and violence, and wounded by a widespread individualism which divides human beings, setting them against one another as they pursue their own well-being. In various countries, conflicts and old divisions from the past are re-emerging. I especially ask Christians and communities throughout the world to offer a radiant and attractive witness of fraternal communion. Let everyone admire how you care for one another, how you encourage and accompany one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. This was Jesus' heartfelt prayer to the Father, that they may all be one in us, so that the world may believe. Beware of the temptation of jealousy. We are all in the same boat and headed to the same port. Let us ask for the grace to rejoice in the gifts of each, which belong to all. Those wounded by historical divisions find it difficult to accept our invitation to forgiveness and reconciliation, since they think that we are ignoring their pain or are asking them to give up their memory and ideals. But if they see the witness of authentically fraternal and reconciled communities, they will find that witness luminous and attractive. It always pains me greatly to discover how some Christian communities, and even consecrated persons, can tolerate different forms of enmity, division, calumny, defamation, vendetta, jealousy, and the desire to impose certain ideas at all costs, even to persecutions which appear as veritable witch hunts. Whom are we going to evangelize if this is the way we act? Let us ask the Lord to help us understand the law of love. How good it is to have this law, how much good it does us to love one another in spite of everything. Yes, in spite of everything. St. Paul's exhortation is directed to each of us when he says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And again, "Let us not grow weary in doing what is right." We all have our likes and dislikes, and perhaps at this very moment we are angry with someone. At least let us say to the Lord, "Lord, I am angry with this person, with that person. I pray to you for him and for her." To pray for a person with whom I am irritated is a beautiful step forward in love and an act of evangelization. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of the ideal of fraternal love. Other ecclesial challenges. Lay people are, put simply, the vast majority of the people of God. The minority, ordained ministers, are at their service. There has been a growing awareness of the identity and mission of the laity in the Church. We can count on many laypersons, although still not nearly enough, who have a deeply rooted sense of community and great fidelity to the tasks of charity, catechesis, and the celebration of the faith. At the same time, a clear awareness of this responsibility of the laity, grounded in their baptism and confirmation, does not appear in the same way in all places. In some cases, it is because lay persons have not been given the formation needed to take on important responsibilities. In others, it is because in their particular churches, room has not been made for them to speak and to act, due to an excessive clericalism which keeps them away from decision-making. Even if many are now involved in lay ministries, this involvement is not reflected in a greater penetration of Christian values in the social, political, and economic sectors. It often remains tied to tasks within the Church, without a real commitment to applying the gospel to the transformation of society. The formation of the laity and the evangelization of professional and intellectual life represent a significant pastoral challenge. The Church acknowledges the indispensable contribution which women make to society through the sensitivity, intuition, and other distinctive skill sets which they, more than men, tend to possess. I think, for example, of the special concern which women show to others, which finds a particular, even if not exclusive, expression in motherhood. I readily acknowledge that many women share pastoral responsibilities with priests, helping to guide people, families and groups, and offering new contributions to theological reflection. But we need to create still broader opportunities for a more inclusive female presence in the Church, because the feminine genius is needed in all expressions in the life of society. The presence of women must also be guaranteed in the workplace, and in the various other settings where important decisions are made, both in the Church and in social structures. Demands that the legitimate rights of women be respected, based on the firm conviction that men and women are equal in dignity, present the church with profound and challenging questions which cannot be lightly evaded. The reservation of the priesthood to males, as a sign of Christ the spouse who gives himself in the Eucharist, is not a question open to discussion. But it can prove especially divisive if sacramental power is too closely identified with power in general. It must be remembered that when we speak of sacramental power, we are in the realm of function, not that of dignity or holiness. The ministerial priesthood is one means employed by Jesus for the service of his people. Yet our great dignity derives from baptism, which is accessible to all. The configuration of the priest to Christ the head, namely as the principal source of grace, does not imply an exaltation which should set him above others. In the Church, functions do not favor the superiority of some vis-a-vis the others. Indeed, a woman, Mary, is more important than the bishops. Even when the function of ministerial priesthood is considered hierarchical, it must be remembered that it is totally ordered to the holiness of Christ's members. Its key and access is not power understood as domination, but the power to administer the sacrament of the Eucharist. This is the origin of its authority, which is always a service to God's people. This presents a great challenge for pastors and theologians who are in a position to recognize more fully what this entails with regard to the possible role of women in decision-making in different areas of the Church's life. Youth ministry, as traditionally organized, has also suffered the impact of social changes. Young people often fail to find responses to their concerns, needs, problems, and hurts in the usual structures. As adults, we find it hard to listen patiently to them, to appreciate their concerns and demands, and to speak to them in a language they can understand. For the same reason, our efforts in the field of education do not produce the results expected. The rise and growth of associations and movements, mostly made up of young people, can be seen as the work of the Holy Spirit, who blazes new trails to meet their expectations and their search for a deep spirituality and a more real sense of belonging. There remains a need, however, to ensure that these associations actively participate in the Church's overall pastoral efforts. Even if it is not always easy to approach young people, progress has been made in two areas: the awareness that the entire community is called to evangelize and educate the young, and the urgent need for the young to exercise greater leadership. We should recognize that despite the present crisis of commitment and communal relationships, many young people are making common cause before the problems of our world and are taking up various forms of activism and volunteer work. Some take part in the life of the Church as members of service groups and various missionary initiatives in their own dioceses and in other places. How beautiful it is to see that young people are street preachers, callejeros de la fe, joyfully bringing Jesus to every street, every town square, and every corner of the earth. Many places are experiencing a dearth of vocations to the priesthood and consecrated life. This is often due to a lack of contagious apostolic fervor in communities, which result in a cooling of enthusiasm and attractiveness. Wherever there is life, fervor, and a desire to bring Christ to others, genuine vocations will arise. Even in parishes where priests are not particularly committed or joyful, the fraternal life and fervor of the community can awaken in the young a desire to consecrate themselves completely to God and to the preaching of the gospel. This is particularly true if such a living community prays insistently for vocations and courageously proposes to its young people the path of special consecration. On the other hand, despite the scarcity of vocations, today we are increasingly aware of the need for a better process of selecting candidates to the priesthood. Seminaries cannot accept candidates on the basis of any motivation whatsoever, especially if those motivations have to do with affective insecurity or the pursuit of power, human glory, or economic well-being. As I mentioned above, I have not sought to offer a complete diagnosis, but I invite communities to complete and enrich these perspectives on the basis of their awareness of their challenges facing them and their neighborhoods. It is my hope that in doing so, they will realize that wherever we attempt to read the signs of the times, it is helpful to listen to young people and the elderly. Both represent a source of hope for every people. The elderly bring with them memory and the wisdom of experience, which warns us not to foolishly repeat our past mistakes. Young people call us to renewed and expansive hope, for they represent new directions for humanity and open us up to the future, lest we cling to a nostalgia for structures and customs which are no longer life-giving in today's world. Challenges exist to be overcome. Let us be realists, but without losing our joy, our boldness, and our hope-filled commitment. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of missionary vigor.